Nothing strikes fear into a CS player more than these two subtle and unassuming sounds. High risk and high reward, the infamous AWP is recognizable by its signature earth-shattering firing sound and its one-shot, one-kill policy. Easily the most popular weapon in CounterStrike, and almost as iconic as the game itself, the AWP has been around since the very beginning. It's also seen many iterations, but it's always kept its iconic scope clicks and green finish. The AWP in Counter-Strike is actually a combination of 3 real-world weapons, all hailing from the Arctic Warfare line of precision rifles. Starting its life as the equally as famous British L96A1, it was later adopted by Swedish military who modified the gun to be used in freezing temperatures, giving it the Arctic Warfare name. Referred to as the AW, it was later adapted for police forces, who shortened the barrel and dropped the caliber down to a slightly less powerful but more available round, and the Arctic Warfare Police, or AWP, was born. But this stubby and less powerful AW is not what CS players are used to. For that we turn to the Arctic Warfare Magnum, or AWM. An extended barrel version of the original AW, it fires a much larger 338 Lapua round for greatly increased stopping power. So in the end it gets its name from the police version, and it gets its functionality from the much bigger and badder Magnum version. Because let's face it, the bigger the bang, the more fun it is to play with. Now that we've explained the strange Frankenstein nature of the AWP in CS, let's go all the way back to the very first sighting of the AWP in Counter-Strike 1.6. The now multi-million-dollar Counter-Strike series actually started its life in 1999 as a mod for the first Half-Life game. Due to the first installment of CS being a mod, a lot of the weapons don't use their real names, mainly to avoid copyright as the small 2-man dev team couldn't possibly afford the rights for every gun. Once you've won a few rounds, either team can navigate to the Rifles tab of the buy menu and pick up their very own accurately named Magnum sniper rifle. Despite the various name changes, the fact it's based off a real-life weapon means the in-game model has followed the same template over the years. Sporting the same green finish and unusable bipod since the beginning, it's a very boxy and low-poly version of the rifle in 1.6. The crosshair features a red dot in the center and range-finding dots along the vertical and horizontal lines, and interestingly, when viewing the AWP in the hands of another player, or when it's dropped on the ground, the bipod doesn't seem to exist anymore. I mean, not that you could use it anyway, but still. It's also a completely different shade of green when dropped, and even more strangely, it's roughly the same length as the AK-47 when dropped too, something that makes the game completely unplayable. These odd issues aside, the sounds this early AWP make are also very familiar, with an earth-shattering firing sound that really drives home how powerful this rifle is. Interestingly, the scope-in sound is pretty much untouched from 1.6 all the way to CSGO, with the menacing click of the scope alerting enemies not to peek. On the topic of the scope, it's more of an octagon than anything and takes up an unusual amount of screen space. It's also so long that you can't actually see the scope glass when holding the weapon. It only pops up for a quick second when moving or while looking down. This is probably a deliberate design choice due to the fact the bright blue scope glass isn't actually using a reflection of anything, but is instead just a painted on static texture. The inside of the scope is also strangely square, which is probably why the devs tried to keep it hidden off screen in the first place. Jumping from 1999 to early 2004, with Valve's follow-up title Counter-Strike Condition Zero, we get to see an updated version of the original Magnum sniper rifle. Still called the Magnum sniper rifle and costing the same $47.50 to purchase, the mechanics of this rifle were pretty much the same, with the real differences being in the new updated model. You'll also notice rear iron sights on the weapon now underneath the scope, something that was missing in previous incarnations of the weapon and wouldn't make a return in following games. Overall, there's slightly more polygons on this model compared to the original 1999 version, especially in the scope, making it look a little less chunky, yet arguably it has worse textures. Also, the weapon size while it's dropped is still off. As this was a graphical update, the weapon sounds are pretty much the same. In this Condition 0 version, the scope glass is no longer blue, but is still not using reflections, so it's cleverly hidden off screen like in the previous title. CS 1.6 and Condition 0 both run on the same gold source engine, which I'm fairly sure didn't actually support cube map reflections, but luckily Valve's next engine was about to change that for good. I know what you're thinking, 2004 seems a little bit late in the evolution of games, and for 2004 they look a little dated. Keep in mind that Halo 2 was also released in 2004, and despite being a console release, it has drastically better graphics than Condition 0. Well, let me explain. This is because Valve wanted to do a final send-off of the original 1.6 mod, before blowing it away later that year with their brand new Source engine, and CounterStrike Source. In Source, it's still called the Magnum Sniper Rifle and still costs the same $47.50. But other than that, this is a completely new iteration of the AWP. Easily the highest quality version yet, with great textures and a massively increased polygon count. This means the gun is no longer a blocky mess. The front iron sights that have been part of the barrel design for the last two games have been removed in this version, except when the weapon is viewed in third person. As well as no longer looking like a hexagon, the scope glass finally has reflections now, and is no longer hidden off screen thanks to the new Source engine's ability to use cube map reflections. For instance, you can see the fancy new reflections on the scope glass while playing DE Nuke, but not DE Dust 2. Weird. This aside, you can now spot some freshly added dirt on the scope glass when zoomed in, as well as noticing the new thinner crosshair that no longer features range-finding dots. Sound-wise, the classic scope-in click is still present and as intimidating as ever, and so is the firing sound. Slightly more bassy and punchy, it's still very evident you don't want to be hit by this thing. This version of the AWP, or Magnum Sniper Rifle as it's referred to in-game, was purchased and used by millions of players over Source's nearly 10-year reign in the competitive first-person shooter scene. But jumping from Source to Valve's next Counter-Strike title, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, we get to see the final and most popular version of the AWP. However, we also get to peel back the curtain a bit and look at the unseen pre-release versions of CSGO. A full year before CSGO as we know it was released in 2012, Valve were busy alpha testing the game, and it definitely looked very different to what we're used to. Now this alpha version of the game is still running on the Source engine and is actually still called Counter-Strike Source in the Windows tab, and strangely has the Portal 2 icon? No idea, but this is the earliest look at the AWP in CSGO that we can get, and not surprisingly it still costs the same $47.50 and is still called the Magnum Sniper Rifle. Again, that's about where the similarities stop. The bolt is now on the familiar right hand side of the gun, and it's now got a hideous, terrible looking scope. And it's not just the AWP that has this ugly camera lens like scope. The Scout and the DAC both have it as well, making them all literally unusable and the game unplayable. That aside, the Magnum Sniper Rifle now has a black finish, just like the AWP does in real life, so it's clear they had already decided on it being called the AWP before actually changing the name in-game. Besides the scope glass being horrific to look at, it has no reflections at all in this early version. The crosshair doesn't blur when strafing in this early version either. Luckily, the alpha testers had the same opinion about the scope, and a year later when CSGO was complete and finally released in 2012, we were greeted with a brand new iteration of the AWP. Still $47.50 to buy, and now back to its iconic green finish. This full release version of CSGO blesses us with a normal looking scope this time. It's also got some weird looking edges on the scope that seem like they need to be smoothed out, but other than that it's a pretty nice model. This AWP is the highest poly version yet, way more so than the Xbox orientated alpha we were just looking at. It's running on the same engine as Counter-Strike Source, but 8 years of optimization means the devs have infinitely more polygons to work with. This 2012 release version of the game also has a weird animation bug with the AWP that makes the gun point upwards after reloading. Weird. Sound-wise, it's literally the same as the alpha, so not much to see here. Or here. Moving on to the scope, it has the same thin crosshair as the Alpha, but now blurs when strafing. It's obvious they're trying to make it very apparent to the player that the weapon won't be fully accurate when moving. And looking through the scope is really quite blurry. It feels like someone's rubbed Vaseline all over the end of the scope. But I guess they didn't take visibility issues as seriously back then as they do now. All that weirdness aside, the scope glass on this 2012 version has a really nice blue tint to it, and scope reflections, at least on some maps. It's weird, it's the complete opposite of Source, with Nuke no longer having scope reflections, but Dust 2 having really quite nice reflections. But overall, this 2012 release version is the best looking out of the bunch. And through CSGO's again nearly 10-year reign as a competitive first-person shooter, the AWP became one of the most iconic weapons not only in CS, but in video games in general. So how do you improve something that many people think is perfect the way it is? Jumping from 2012 to the current 2020 version of the rifle, you'll notice two things: new sounds and new animations. Model-wise, it's the same model but with different shaders, smoothing out some of the weirder edges on the scope, and overall it's one of the best looking guns in the game. The difference between the animations in the 2012 version and the current 2020 version is slight, but side by side you'll notice a slightly different recoil on the gun when firing. The old AWP pulling up heaps when firing and the new one pulling back more. Other than that, the reloading and bolt pull animations appear to be untouched, with the next differences being the sounds. Sound-wise, a major update in 2015 changed the sound of the AWP for good. And I'll cut right to the chase. Here's the before and after. The new AWP sound seems quieter, but it's mainly due to the fact it's not as compressed and crunchy sounding as the original. It sounds roomier and is more realistic, and is honestly much more pleasing to listen to. But it doesn't lose its intimidating nature, still sounding like the most powerful weapon in the game. However, other things like the bolt pull and reloading sounds are the same. The final difference in the AWP in the current 2020 version is the movement. It was given a lower movement speed, especially while scoped in, which means the aggressing peaking synonymous with the AWP had to be dialed back a bit. This controversial topic aside, these final adjustments to the AWP provide a nice new feel to the weapon that's been used millions of times across 4 major titles and 20 plus years. With CounterStrike Source being at the top for around a decade before a new title, CSGO is pulling in rather close to that number. And now with talks of Valve's new Source 2 engine, it could be sooner than ever that we see a new iteration of the AWP. So let us know which version of the AWP is your favourite, and what weapon should we dive into next time. Drop a comment below, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.